In the spring of 1890, Congress quietly transferred a small mud bank in New York Harbor from the United States Navy to the Treasury Department and authorized $75,000 for the construction of what the official appropriation described as a federal immigration depot. The depot opened on the 1st of January 1892 under the name Ellis Island. Over the next 62 years, 12 million immigrants would pass through its halls, and the building itself would become one of the most powerful symbols in the American story. The huddled masses, the torch held aloft, the handkerchief waved from the deck of a steamship as the New York skyline came into view. Every American schoolchild learns the story, every documentary repeats it, every museum exhibit reinforces it, but the appropriation that built Ellis Island was not principally an immigration measure. The men who drafted it were not, in their primary capacity, concerned with the welfare or the screening of immigrants. They were concerned with something else entirely. They were concerned with a financial crisis in the labor market of the eastern seaboard, with a political problem in the major industrial states, and with a specific commercial arrangement between the United States Treasury and the steamship lines that was, by 1890, on the verge of collapse. Ellis Island was built to solve those problems. The immigration story was the cover. If you know where to look, the documentary trail makes this plain. The original Treasury Department correspondence, the internal memoranda of the Bureau of Immigration, the committee transcripts of the House Ways and Means Subcommittee that drafted the 1891 Immigration Act, the contract files between the federal government and the Hamburg American Line, the North German Lloyd, the Cunard Steamship Company, and the half-dozen other carriers that dominated the transatlantic passenger trade. None of these documents are secret. None of them are difficult to access. They sit in the National Archives, in the New York Public Library's Manuscripts Division, in the Hagley Library in Delaware, and in the records of the steamship companies themselves, several of which were acquired and preserved by maritime museums in the 20th century. They have simply been ignored because the story they tell is not the story Americans have agreed to tell about themselves. If you want the full archival breakdown of every steamship contract between the federal government and the major carriers from 1882 to 1924, including the head tax accounting and the kickback structures that made Ellis Island profitable, hit subscribe right now. Every Tuesday I publish an investigation into the economic history that got buried under the patriotic version. There is a video on screen about the 1882 Immigration Act and the Chinese exclusion finance trail that sets up everything in this one. Click it when you finish here. To understand why Ellis Island was built, you have to understand what came before it and what was breaking down. Before 1890, the screening and processing of immigrants arriving at the port of New York was conducted at a facility called Castle Garden on the southern tip of Manhattan. Castle Garden was operated not by the federal government but by the state of New York through a body called the Commissioners of Emigration, which had been established in 1847 in response to the influx from the Irish famine. The arrangement was unusual by modern standards. The federal government had no immigration apparatus of its own. It had no immigration law worth the name until 1875. The states ran the ports, the states screened the arrivals, and the states collected the fees. New York, which received roughly 70% of all transatlantic immigrant traffic, ran the most lucrative operation by a considerable margin. The fee structure was the heart of it. Every immigrant who landed at Castle Garden was assessed a head tax, paid by the steamship company that brought them, which in turn passed the cost on to the passenger as part of the ticket price. In 1882, Congress passed the first Federal Immigration Act, which imposed a federal head tax of 50 cents per immigrant on top of whatever the states were collecting. The federal portion was supposed to fund a relief account for indigent arrivals and to support the gradual development of federal oversight. By 1890, the head tax was generating something on the order of $400,000 a year, a substantial sum in the dollars of that period, and the question of who controlled the collection and disbursement of those funds had become a serious political fight. The state of New York was, by the late 1880s, in open conflict with the Federal Treasury Department over the administration of Castle Garden. The state was accused, with considerable evidence, of skimming from the head tax revenue, of selling concessions to railroad ticket agents and money changers operating inside the facility, and of allowing a network of corrupt boarding house runners to prey on arriving immigrants the moment they cleared the gates. The federal investigation that ran from 1887 to 1889 produced a report, 240 pages long, that documented in detail the financial irregularities at Castle Garden. The report was written by a Treasury official named William Owen, and it concluded that the state operation was, in his words, beyond reform and ought to be terminated by federal action. Owen's report is the document that triggered the construction of Ellis Island, but the construction was not, as the public narrative suggests, primarily about cleaning up the corruption at Castle Garden. It was about transferring the revenue stream from the state to the federal government, and from the federal treasury directly to a small number of preferred contractors. Here is what the appropriation actually did. The $75,000 authorized in 1890 was the seed money. The full cost of constructing and operating Ellis Island between 1890 and 1900 came to approximately $3 million, drawn from a combination of direct appropriations, head tax revenues, and contract fees paid by the steamship lines. The contracts with the steamship lines are the part of the story that almost no one has written about. Beginning in 1891, the federal government required that every passenger steamship landing at the port of New York deliver its third-class and steerage passengers to Ellis Island for processing. The first and second-class passengers, the wealthy travellers, were processed on board the ship and released directly into Manhattan. Only the poor were funneled through the island, and the contracts that governed how that funneling worked were, in the term of the period, sweetheart deals. The major lines paid a per-head fee to the federal government for each passenger landed. The fee covered processing, detention, deportation if necessary, and a guaranteed allocation of bunk space in the federal dormitories for any passenger held for medical or legal review. The fee was set by negotiation, not by statute, and the negotiations were conducted by a small group of Treasury officials whose relationships with the steamship company executives were, on the documentary record, considerably closer than arm's length. Consider the Hamburg American line. By 1893, Hamburg American was landing more immigrants at Ellis Island than any other carrier. Its New York agent was a man named Emil Boas, who served as the line's general manager in the United States from 1879 until his death in 1912. Boas was a member of the same yacht clubs, the same banking syndicates, and in several cases the same corporate boards as the senior officials at the Treasury Department who oversaw the immigration contracts. The line's ledgers, which survive in the archive of the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven, show that the per-head fee Hamburg American paid to the federal government was consistently lower on a per-passenger basis than the fees paid by smaller competitors. The difference was not large in any single year. Across the decade from 1893 to 1903, it amounted to several $100,000 in cumulative savings. Hamburg American's market share in the transatlantic immigrant trade grew from roughly 12% to roughly 28% over that same decade. The smaller competitors who paid the higher fees either consolidated or went out of business. The mechanism by which the fee differential was created is itself worth examining, because it reveals the operational architecture of the system more clearly than any single contract document. The federal government did not, on paper, charge different rates to different carriers. The published rate was the same for everyone. The differential came in through a back door called the bonding requirement. Every steamship line operating into Ellis Island was required to post a bond against the cost of deporting any passenger who failed inspection. The bond was set at a fixed dollar amount per passenger, but the actual draw against the bond, the rate at which deportations were charged back to the carrier, was determined by the federal commissioner on a case-by-case basis. The major lines, which had standing relationships with the Bureau and which paid for the higher tier of contract administration services, saw deportation chargebacks at rates well below the schedule. The smaller lines, which lacked those relationships, saw chargebacks at or above the schedule, and in several documented cases at rates that exceeded the actual cost of the deportation. The differential was, in effect, a hidden subsidy to the major carriers, paid through the discretionary administration of a regulatory cost. The same legal framework that produced the public health and public order outcomes the inspections were said to serve was simultaneously producing the competitive distortion that consolidated the trade in the hands of the largest operators. There was no contradiction between the two functions, because the system was designed to perform both at once. The competitive consolidation had effects that ran well beyond the immigrant trade itself. By 1907, the four largest transatlantic carriers, Hamburg American, North German Lloyd, Cunard, and the White Star Line, controlled approximately 72% of all passenger movement between Europe and the eastern United States. The freight that those same vessels carried on their westbound voyages, the passengers were, in the economic logic of the trade, ballast against the more profitable eastbound freight, was governed by shipping conferences whose pricing power was directly tied to the consolidation that the immigration system had helped to produce. The lines that had grown fat on the per-head differential at Ellis Island were the same lines that set the freight rates on grain, cotton, and manufactured goods moving in both directions across the Atlantic. The federal government, through its discretionary administration of the immigrant trade, had subsidized the formation of a transatlantic shipping cartel, and the costs of that cartel were ultimately borne by American farmers and exporters who paid the inflated freight rates. None of this was visible in the public discussion of immigration policy, because the public discussion was conducted in the language of huddled masses and golden doors rather than in the language of bonding requirements and conference rates. The men who actually ran the system spoke both languages. They knew which one was for the public and which one was for each other. This is the part of the Ellis Island story that the conventional narrative has no place for. The island was not, in its operational reality, a neutral processing centre for arriving immigrants. It was a financial choke point, deliberately constructed to consolidate the immigrant trade in the hands of a small number of large carriers, and to convert the head tax revenue that had previously flowed to the state of New York into a federal revenue stream that could be selectively rebated to those carriers through favourable contract terms. The arrangement benefited the federal treasury, which gained a reliable new revenue source. It benefited the major steamship lines, which gained competitive advantage over their smaller rivals, and it benefited the political coalition that controlled the federal government in the 1890s, which gained both the patronage opportunities of staffing the new federal facility and the campaign contributions of the steamship companies whose interests the facility was structured to protect. The immigrants themselves in this arrangement were not the customers, they were the commodity. Every passenger who passed through Ellis Island generated a fee, a portion of which was retained by the federal government, a portion of which was rebated to the carrier through contract pricing, and a portion of which funded the patronage payroll of the facility itself. The medical inspections, the legal questioning, the brief detentions for review, all of these served real public health and public order functions, but they also served a financial function. They generated a justification for the per-head fee. They provided a regulatory rationale for the existence of the facility, and they ensured that the third-class and steerage trade, which was where the volume was, would be funneled exclusively through the federal choke point, rather than processed at private piers or competing facilities. The political problem that Ellis Island also solved is, if anything, more revealing. By the late 1880s, the major industrial states of the eastern seaboard were facing a labour problem that had begun to threaten the political stability of the Republican coalition that had dominated national politics since the Civil War. The problem was not a shortage of labour, it was a surplus, combined with rising labour militancy and the early stages of organised resistance to industrial wage suppression. The Haymarket Affair in 1886, the rolling rail strikes of 1877 and 1885, the formation of the Knights of Labour and the early American Federation of Labour, all of these were producing a political climate in which the eastern industrial elite was looking for ways to manage the labour supply more directly. Immigration was the lever. The volume of immigrant labour flowing through New York Harbour was, in raw numerical terms, the single most important factor in setting urban industrial wage levels in the period. Control the flow, and you control the wage. Control the wage, and you control the political problem. Ellis Island, in this reading, was not a humanitarian facility. It was a regulatory valve. The medical inspections, the literacy tests, the public charge exclusions, the contract labour restrictions that were progressively layered on through the 1891, 1893, 1903, and 1907 Immigration Acts were not primarily about screening for disease or deviance. They were about giving the federal government the discretionary authority to throttle the immigrant flow up or down according to the labour market needs of the industrial coalition that controlled the apparatus. When industrial demand was high and wages needed to be suppressed, the inspections were perfunctory and the exclusion rates were low. When industrial demand was soft and political pressure to protect domestic labour was rising, the inspections tightened and the exclusion rates climbed. The numbers drawn from the annual reports of the Commissioner General of Immigration bear this out. In the boom years of 1905 to 1907, when the steel and rail industries were running at capacity, exclusion rates at Ellis Island ran below 1%. In the recession year of 1908, they nearly tripled. The legal framework had not changed. The discretion had simply been applied differently. The men who designed this system understood exactly what they were doing. The internal memoranda of the Bureau of Immigration, particularly the correspondence between Commissioner General Frank Sargent and his deputies between 1903 and 1908, contain explicit discussions of the relationship between exclusion rates and labour market conditions. Sargent, in a memo dated November of 1907, wrote to his New York commissioner that the Bureau ought to consider, given the contraction in industrial employment, whether the public charge provisions of the 1907 Act might be applied with greater rigour in the coming season. The memo does not use the word wages. It does not need to. The connection between immigrant exclusion and labour supply was understood by every official in the chain of command. It was simply not stated in public. Now, the conventional history of American immigration tends to frame the restrictionist movement of the early 20th century as a story about nativism, about the racial and ethnic anxieties of native-born Americans confronted with the new immigration from southern and eastern Europe. That framing is not wrong. The nativist anxieties were real, and they generated real political pressure. But the framing is incomplete because it treats the legal and institutional infrastructure of immigration restriction as if it were a response to popular sentiment, when the documentary record shows that it was, at least equally, a response to industrial labour market needs. The Dillingham Commission, which spent 42 volumes in 3 years between 1907 and 1910, studying immigration and producing the recommendations that would eventually become the basis of the 1924 quota system, was not a populist body. It was funded by Congress at the request of the same industrial coalition that controlled immigration policy more broadly, and its conclusions tracked the labour market preferences of that coalition with considerable precision. The 1924 Act, which slashed immigration by roughly 80% and which is conventionally framed as the triumph of nativism, was passed at a moment when the post-war industrial boom was tapering and when the major employers had already begun to shift their labour strategies toward internal migration of African Americans from the rural South and toward early mechanization. The immigrant labour surplus that had served the economy in the 1890s and 1900s was no longer needed. The valve was closed. Ellis Island throughout this period served as the operational hardware of the valve. The processing capacity of the island, which was expanded twice in 1900 and again in 1907, was sized to accommodate the throughput that the labour market demanded. When throughput needed to drop, the inspection regime tightened. When it needed to rise, the regime loosened. The immigrants who passed through the Great Hall, who carried their suitcases and their hopes up the long staircase that the inspectors used to assess their physical fitness without their knowing it was a test, were not the subjects of an immigration policy. They were the inputs of a labour management system. The policy itself was about the inputs, not about them. This is not a comfortable framing for a country that has built a large portion of its national mythology around the Ellis Island experience. The poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty, the immigrant memoir literature that flourished from the 1920s onward, the political invocations of grandparents and great-grandparents who came through the Great Hall and built a better life. All of these are sincere. They reflect real experiences and real outcomes. 12 million people did pass through that facility. Many of their descendants did, in fact, build better lives. Those stories are not lies, but they are the consumer surface of a system whose underlying logic was something other than what the surface suggested. The descendants who tell those stories now are not wrong about what happened to their families. They are simply, in most cases, unaware of the institutional and economic architecture that determined which families got to come, when they got to come, and on what terms. The architecture itself is, when you trace it carefully, a matter of public record. The Treasury Department's annual reports from 1891 forward contain the head tax accounting, the contract revenue figures, and the operating budgets of the federal immigration apparatus. The Bureau of Immigration's annual reports contain the exclusion statistics broken down by category and by year. The records of the major steamship lines where they survive contain the per-passenger fees, the corporate correspondence with federal officials, and in some cases the internal projections that show how immigration policy changes were anticipated and prepared for in advance. The papers of the leading industrial figures of the period, the Carnegies, the Fricks, the railroad executives whose lobbying shaped the Immigration Acts, contain the political correspondence that ties the legislative outcomes to the industrial preferences. Each piece, taken alone, is a fragment. Taken together, the picture they form is unambiguous. There is one document in particular that deserves attention, because it captures the underlying logic of the system in a way that the more diffuse correspondence does not. In 1909, a Treasury Department official named Robert Watchorn, who had served as the second commissioner of Ellis Island from 1905 to 1909, retired from federal service and took a position with the Union Oil Company in California. Before he left, he wrote a long internal memorandum to his successor, William Williams, that laid out his understanding of the office and its responsibilities. The memorandum, which survives in Watchorn's personal papers at a research library in Pennsylvania, runs to 37 pages. Most of it is procedural. The portion that is not procedural, that runs from page 24 to page 31, contains Watchorn's candid assessment of the political and economic constituencies that the commissioner served. He named the steamship lines explicitly. He named the industrial associations explicitly. He described in plain language the calibration of inspection intensity to labour market conditions. And he wrote, in a passage that has been quoted twice in scholarly literature, and never, to my knowledge, in popular treatments, that the Commissioner of Ellis Island was, in effect, a regulator of the supply of unskilled industrial labour in the eastern United States, and that the immigration laws were the instruments through which that regulation was conducted. He used the word regulator. He used the word supply. He used the phrase unskilled industrial labour. There is no ambiguity in the document. Watchorn's memorandum was not intended for public consumption. It was a frank handover document, written by a departing official to an incoming one, with the assumption that both men understood the realities of the position and that the document would remain within the Bureau. It did remain within the Bureau in copy form until Watchorn's death in 1944, at which point his personal papers were donated to the library where they now reside. The memorandum was first catalogued and made available to researchers in the late 1970s. It has been cited, as I said, twice. The reason it has been cited only twice is not that it is obscure. It is that the framework it implies is incompatible with the framework that American immigration history is conventionally taught within. To take Watchorn's description seriously is to accept that the institutional purpose of Ellis Island, in the eyes of the men who actually ran it, was the management of industrial labour supply, with everything else, the screening, the sentiment, the symbolism layered on top. The financial dimensions of this management were substantial. Between 1892 and 1924, the federal government collected, by the most conservative estimate, something on the order of $110 million in head tax revenue from immigrants processed through Ellis Island and the smaller federal facilities at Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and other ports. Adjusted to current dollars, this is a sum in the multiple billions. The expenditure of that revenue was, in formal terms, controlled by appropriations made by Congress. In operational terms, it was controlled by the Treasury Department officials who set the per-head contract fees, who allocated the rebates to the major carriers, and who staffed the patronage payrolls of the federal immigration facilities. The relationship between the formal appropriation process and the operational allocation was not, on the documentary record, particularly close. The head tax was, in effect, a captive revenue stream generated by a captive constituency, the immigrants who had no political voice and no legal recourse, and dispersed by an administrative apparatus whose accountability to Congress was nominal at best. The political coalition that benefited from this arrangement was, throughout the period from 1890 to 1924, the dominant coalition in American national politics. The Republican Party, with the partial exception of the Wilson administration's 2 terms, controlled the executive branch for most of the period, and the industrial wing of the Republican Party, the Eastern manufacturing and finance interests that had been ascendant since the Civil War, controlled the immigration policy apparatus throughout. The Democratic opposition, particularly in its agrarian and southern formations, was generally hostile to mass immigration, but the Democratic Party did not control the executive branch long enough or thoroughly enough to dismantle the system. The 1924 Quota Act, which is sometimes credited to democratic and progressive restrictionism, was in fact a product of the Republican Coolidge administration, and it represented not the defeat of the industrial coalition, but its strategic decision that the immigrant labor supply was no longer needed at the volumes it had previously demanded. The valve was closed by the same hands that had opened it. What does it mean to revisit Ellis Island through this lens? It does not mean discarding the personal stories of the 12 million who passed through. Those stories are real and they matter. It means understanding that those stories took place inside a system that was designed for purposes other than the welfare of the people moving through it, and that the system's design reflected the economic and political interests of a specific class of Americans whose names do not appear on any of the museum plaques. It means recognizing that the symbolism of Ellis Island, the way it has been deployed in American political and cultural rhetoric, has served, intentionally or not, to obscure the economic architecture that the facility was actually built to operate. And it means, perhaps most importantly, asking what other parts of American institutional history have been mythologized in similar ways, what other facilities and policies and laws have been wrapped in patriotic or humanitarian narratives that do not match the documentary record of why they were actually constructed. The conventional history of American immigration, the textbook history, is not false. It is incomplete. The huddled masses came. The torch did light their way, in a manner of speaking. The descendants did build lives that their ancestors could not have imagined. All of that is real. But the building they passed through was not what the textbooks say it was. It was a financial instrument, a labor management tool, and a political arrangement dressed up in the iconography of welcome. The men who built it knew exactly what it was. They left the documentary trail to prove it. The trail is sitting in the archives now, waiting to be read by anyone who cares to look at the country's actual history, rather than the version it has agreed to tell itself. Ellis Island was decommissioned as an immigration facility in 1954. It was reopened as a museum in 1990, after a major restoration funded in part by private donations from corporate sponsors whose names are inscribed on the walls of the Great Hall. The museum tells the story of the immigrant experience. It does not tell the story of the head tax accounting, the steamship contracts, the per-passenger fee structures, or the Watchorn Memorandum. It does not tell the story of Hamburg American's competitive advantage, of Sargent's exclusion calibration, of the Dillingham Commission's industrial provenance. It tells the story the country has agreed to tell. And the story the country has agreed to tell is, as is so often the case with national stories, a story that flatters the present at the expense of the past. The full architecture of the system is documented, the contracts exist, the memoranda exist, the accounting exists. They are accessible to anyone willing to spend time in the right archives, and they tell a story that is, on the whole, more interesting and more revealing than the one on the museum plaques. They do not require any speculation about hidden conspiracies or secret cabals. They require only a willingness to read the documents the institutions themselves preserved, and to take seriously what those documents say about why the institution was built and how it actually worked. Ellis Island was built to consolidate revenue, to manage labor, and to entrench a political coalition. The immigration story was the consequence, not the purpose. Both things can be true. They were true at the same time in the same building for the same 6 decades.